Look at the history of almost any major city, and you will notice something curious. It burned, then it was rebuilt. It flooded, then it was rebuilt again. War came, and once again it was rebuilt. At first, this seems like the natural rhythm of urban life. Cities suffer disasters, people recover, and construction begins again. It is a story of resilience that appears again and again throughout history. But if you look closely enough, a quieter question begins to appear. Because some cities were not rebuilt once or twice, but again and again and again. Entire districts replaced, street levels raised, infrastructure redesigned, sometimes within surprisingly short periods of time. And after a while, the pattern begins to feel unusual, not because rebuilding happened, but because it happened so often. Official history offers a simple explanation. Cities are fragile places. They gather thousands, sometimes millions of people into tight spaces filled with combustible materials, dense construction, and complicated infrastructure. In earlier centuries, fires could spread quickly across wooden buildings, floods could devastate neighborhoods built near rivers, wars could erase decades of construction almost overnight. London burned in 1666 during the Great Fire. Chicago was devastated by the fire of 1871. San Francisco was nearly destroyed by earthquake and fire in 1906. Across Europe, wars repeatedly reshaped cities, sometimes leaving entire districts in ruins. From this perspective, rebuilding seems almost inevitable. Cities grow, disasters occur, and people rebuild what was lost. But once you begin examining how those rebuildings actually unfolded, the story becomes more complicated. Because rebuilding did not always mean repairing what had been damaged. In many cases, rebuilding meant transforming the entire structure of the city itself. Take Chicago after the fire of 1871. Much of the city had been constructed from wood, and when the fire spread through the dense urban landscape, entire neighborhoods were destroyed. But the rebuilding that followed did not simply recreate what had existed before. New building codes required fire-resistant materials. Stone, brick, and steel replaced wood. The city's skyline began to change, infrastructure expanded. What emerged from the reconstruction was not just the old Chicago repaired, it was a new version of the city entirely. Something similar happened in Paris during the 19th century. Large sections of the medieval city were demolished under the direction of Baron Haussmann. Narrow streets were replaced by wide boulevards. Entire districts disappeared to make way for new infrastructure, new buildings, and a redesigned urban layout. The Paris that visitors recognize today is largely the result of that transformation. And again, this was not simply restoration, it was reinvention. In San Francisco, after the earthquake of 1906, rebuilding also reshaped the city dramatically. Fire-resistant construction became the new standard. Street systems were modified. Infrastructure was modernized. Cities did not merely return to what they had been, they became something different. And once you begin listing these examples, the pattern grows difficult to ignore. Across different continents and different centuries, cities repeatedly passed through moments where the old urban landscape disappeared and a new one emerged in its place. Sometimes the transformation took decades, but sometimes it happened with surprising speed. Entire districts rebuilt within just a few years, massive stone buildings rising where wooden structures once stood, infrastructure networks expanding rapidly beneath the streets. On one level, this speed reflects the determination of the people rebuilding their homes and communities. Human societies have always shown extraordinary resilience after disaster, but reconstruction at this scale also requires enormous coordination. Materials must be quarried and transported, stone blocks cut and shaped, millions of bricks produced, workers organized across vast construction sites, engineers redesign roads, drainage systems, and building foundations. And all of this must happen while the city continues to function. Trade continues. People move through the streets. Daily life goes on. which means that rebuilding a city is not just construction, it is a logistical challenge on a massive scale. And yet, history shows that cities have repeatedly achieved it. This raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps many of the cities we see today are not simply the result of continuous growth. Perhaps they are the result of multiple layers of reinvention, each phase reshaping what came before it. Archaeology offers another perspective. When modern construction projects dig beneath cities, they often reveal earlier layers of urban life, not scattered ruins, but organized environments. Older streets running beneath newer ones, foundations aligned with buildings that no longer exist, drainage systems still intact beneath modern pipes, entire districts preserved below the surface. This pattern is well known in ancient cities like Rome, where centuries of rebuilding created multiple layers of streets stacked on top of one another. In Istanbul, Byzantine structures remain beneath Ottoman and modern construction. In Athens, ancient foundations appear beneath contemporary neighborhoods, but similar patterns appear in many cities that are not usually considered ancient. Modern capitals often sit on top of earlier versions of themselves. From a practical perspective, this makes sense. Completely demolishing a city and starting over would be extremely difficult. It is often easier to build over what already exists, raise the ground level, replace structures gradually, reuse foundations where possible. Over time, the city becomes a layered landscape, the present resting on top of the past. When viewed this way, the repeated rebuilding of cities begins to feel less like a series of isolated disasters and more like a continuous process, cities evolving through cycles of destruction, adaptation, and renewal. When I first began noticing how often cities were rebuilt, I assumed it was simply the result of historical instability, fires, wars, earthquakes, floods. But the deeper I looked, the more it began to feel like something else entirely. Cities are not static places. They are living systems. They expand, they reorganize, and sometimes they replace large parts of themselves in order to survive. What fascinates me most is that the memory of those earlier versions rarely disappears completely. It lingers beneath the surface, in foundations buried below modern buildings, in street alignments that follow older paths, in fragments of architecture hidden beneath newer construction. Walking through a modern city, you're rarely seeing a single moment in history. You're seeing the latest layer of a much longer story, a story that may include several different cities occupying the same ground across time. Cities rarely vanish completely. Even when they burn, collapse, or are abandoned, something remains, a foundation, a street, a piece of infrastructure. And when a city is rebuilt, those fragments often become the starting point for the next version, which means that modern cities are not simply places. They are archives, layered records of decisions, disasters, and reinventions. So, the next time you walk through an old district, pause for a moment, because the buildings around you may not represent the first version of that city, or even the second. They may belong to a place that has already been rebuilt many times before, and the deeper we look beneath the surface, the more versions of the past we may discover still waiting there.